as a futurist, I have been watching for the last couple of weeks as increasingly our public discourse has moved to uh, being very black and white. Either things will end one day and snap back together, or increasingly, as news seems poor, they will never be the same again. I am the CEO of Prescient, the company that is presenting this. We are a small Foresight firm. We have a couple of researchers and partners that we work with when we do more substantial growth consulting. I'm also a professor at Georgetown University, and I was once the CEO of the World Future Society. As I was thinking about this, I thought I would share with you that I'm also a writer and a reader, as I'm sure that you are. And I'm very fascinated by the human need to think in stories. And much of what is unfolding right now, I believe, has to do with our need, which cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists have explained to us, to sense make the world in terms of archetypal story shapes. We want beginnings, we want ends, we want middles, and we want everything to connect and make sense. And most of the time, everything does. So we don't think too hard about the fact that we're doing that all the time. When we want to create something new, this is an amazing capacity. When you want to innovate or instigate transformation or growth, that's an amazing quality. But in crisis, our need to make stories can be very powerfully negative. Once again, we want a beginning, we want a middle, and we want an end, and we want reasons to connect things. And when those reasons aren't there, or we can't make sense of them, psychologists know that we will fill in the blanks ourselves, and we will make up stories. What else happens in crisis? We can't think clearly. The human mind and the limbic system shut down. And so in order to safeguard ourselves from perceived danger, our focus narrows, and scientific study tells us that basically we turn toward making very short-term predictions, and we preserve ourselves from danger by doing that. So I turn to Foresight in moments like these, a profession that is really dedicated to learning how to plan in uncertainty. So a few provocations about how futurists think about the future, an exercise which will take up the bulk of our time, some additional ways that you may be able to incorporate Foresight into your planning now, and some thoughts about what may be coming up ahead. There's nobody who's authoritative right now, no one, it appears, about what is happening. We're all waking up to the same news. I made a list of all the new things that had unfolded out of just the reading of one newspaper article this morning. And there are about 20 things, from election primaries halted or stalled to relief packages to college students not graduating. And I know that we are all in the midst of this at the same time. In this context, it seems really useful to remember that the future, according to futurists, is really only an image or a story, which sounds belittling, but it is in no way intended to. It simply reminds us that it hasn't happened yet, and we don't know what will unfold, which does not mean that empirical evidence doesn't matter. Clearly, we're surrounded by things happening and projections being made that matter a great deal to what could happen. But those coexist with a great deal that we don't know, mostly right now in the realm of human behavior. The biggest mystery of all right now is probably how people at scale and individually are going to respond to all of the new things that are happening to us. But something else that we know is that when collectivities and when people change their story, they can change the outcome of what happens. That's happened in the United States in the last couple of weeks when the presidential administration changed its understanding of what was happening. The facts didn't change, the story changed. And that story unleashed money and other activities that have helped change the United States. It imposed proposed quarantines and so forth. Many things unfolded because of the changing story of the administration. And that is the model that I wanted to bring, not ideologically, but as a model to thinking about organizations or thinking at scale. So everybody in an organization right now has a particular story in their head, and a collective one is probably forming about what could happen. This is the time to strenuously think about how we don't actually know what will happen to our organizations and to the limits and uses of empirical evidence. So what I mean by that is that futurists usually work with two things. One of those are trend data. One of those are things that have established patterns that we know will unfold or we can be quite sure of. There's very little right now with respect to COVID-19 that is absolutely certainly known. Everyone is waiting to see what are the effects of the intense quarantine in China, for example. So public health officials and medical people are thinking hard about what will happen and do not know. Every day they gather more evidence and their projections change. Nevertheless, there are some things that people feel quite certain will unfold. For example, if there are mass claims for unemployment. At the same time, there's a real limit to that empirical evidence. Most of the time in our regular circumstances, we find it hard. I mean, this is my work with companies and with agencies and the government. People actually struggle to think of what kinds of new signals or emerging signals might exist around them because we're sort of focused narrowly on what we're doing in our everyday. So we have to stretch and do research and work hard to kind of open our aperture. Right now, the inverse is basically happening. We're flooded with new events for which there is no history, basically at a rate that is almost hourly. So we don't know what will happen. All we have is this sort of pouring in of signals. In that context, a structured, rigorous use of imagination is a really good planning tool. Being open to thinking about what might happen. And once those what might happens can be developed and explored, those begin to offer opportunities to think about how our organizations, how our institutions, whatever yours is, might respond, adapt, or innovate. So really, this is about creating a range of understandings of what might unfold by being open to the fact that we don't know. And perhaps not getting comfortable at this point with ambiguity, but at least recognizing that there is really no way to produce certainty. I might note that that's actually true every day. It is simply not true as intensely and dramatically and with such existential potential effects as it is now. The other thing that is becoming quite clear, which is always there, but which is there in a very explicit way right now in our environment, is the fact that complexity is real, which is to say that what unfolds in the external environment and then again in our internal organizational environments are the result of interdependent phenomena. So what happens is not simply because one thing or one phenomena unfolds. It's not only because there's a virus. It's not only because there are certain activities in the stock market. It's not only because different institutions, airlines, universities, or so forth act. It is because all of those are going to interact with each other and produce new and again unpredictable effects. Once again, that's something that's always true. It's how we get surprised. It is overtly true for us right now because we see it unfolding in a very dramatic way. Most of the time, my effort and the effort of futurists is to help people recognize some of those facts. I had a couple of standard activities in Foresight. One of them, which has been around for a long time, is called an implications wheel, and you can see that on the screen or on your worksheet. It's a shape that starts with some sort of change or some sort of phenomena in the middle that we expect might change. And it asks us to consider the first and then second, and sometimes the third or fourth layer of implications or consequences that might unfold from particular change. In this case, we're going to use it to ask for a couple of changes and then think about, create scenarios out of that. The first activity is simply to think about a change that you may already be seeing in your organization, or this is the way that I would propose going about this, in the external world, outside of your agency or organization, that you believe may have a consequential effect. I would also propose not choosing something that is too big. Don't choose the entire coronavirus crisis or set of events, and don't choose something too narrow. So what is something that you see evolving right now in your environment that may unfold for you and your organization in the coming few months? I would also propose putting a timeline of about a quarter on this. Start with some sort of change that you believe will unfold for you and your organization in the coming months. An example of this might be, let's say that you are a university administrator and you understand that there may be certain changes coming to the way that student loans are distributed or student loans are disposed of. Something similar might be true in the real estate market. So you may be seeing something in your industry or arena where a way of working is changing. You may want to ask if your remit is to think about the larger world, about the external environment in a larger way, about food security or something like that. Borders closing in certain spaces in the United States, changes unfolding for actors or businesses with less financial muscle power, as Prasad says, small and medium-sized enterprises. Many of you have something to consider that you think might change, might be different. So when you have that for yourself, move to the worksheet and consider what might directly unfold because of that new condition or circumstance, because a supply chain has dried up or had to move in a different direction, because small and medium enterprises are under pressure financially, because there are more people online than there were in just 6 months ago, because people are using more virtual technology. I'm just pulling examples out of what you've shared. And I proposed some specific ways to think about first order consequences, partly to have us all resist putting in only negative consequences. I think that's a very much of the moment. But what might directly unfold? And you don't need to fill out all of these different blanks. They are proposals for you that you think in different spaces of a number of immediate, not potentially in time, but immediate direct consequences of what might, of the change that you have proposed. What might happen at a global level, nationally, that's good from having more people online, or that's good even from having small businesses or medium businesses under pressure. That's challenging. What might happen to the natural environment? What might happen in politics? But the next request is that you take that list that you have on one side of your page and use it to think about what the potential consequences are of the first order change. And this should actually break the link from the first change that you posited, if that makes sense. You are not necessarily thinking what could happen linearly. All you're doing at this point is looking at that left side of your page and seeing that a change unfolded as a consequence of a new circumstance. I'm going to take us to the last bit of this activity and leave you with this then for a few minutes, and then we'll go on. So, what you might have observed is that in doing this activity, you are actually modeling an uncertain environment yourself. We don't have any empirical facts, we don't have any evidence that will help us know what happens to small and medium enterprises, that helps us know whether globalization will halt, or that lets us know right now how the VR, how the virtual reality and augmented reality industries might evolve. In the absence of that, there's an opportunity for us to turn to imagination and start to think about all the things that could happen, and to think about it not only in our own lane, but think about it widely. And that's why all of those different questions about what might happen in the environment or politically are there, because those may produce consequences that do have meaning for your organization. The end result of this activity is actually to think about the second order consequences, that last list that you created, and to think about what a world that had all of that happening in it might look like. Some of it might be good, some of it might be bad. It definitely depends on who's doing the acting, probably. But the thought experiment here, and one that is probably better done in a longer time and in a more collaborative space. So not each of you on your own, but with teammates, maybe on Zoom, is the thought experiment is to recognize that actually there are multiple potential scenarios that might unfold. That's one. It's possible to think about them in advance. It's possible to prepare for some that might be risky. And it's possible to think about where in these lie opportunities. And in this context, I'm not really talking about an amazing new market or something like that, although that may be the case for some of you, some organizations, but opportunities to adapt, to make changes that need to be made anyway, opportunities that you simply didn't see to continue to thrive, using the circumstances, riding those circumstances in ways that you hadn't before. That's quite a bit for, a few minutes together. But I'm hopeful one way, one activity that you may be able to do with your team or with your coworkers, and you can do this endlessly, to consider what might unfold and to find risks and find adaptations and opportunities in this very dynamic environment. A way to make this a more rigorous activity is to use empirical evidence where you can, is to use projections and understand where you need to be imaginative. One of the comments that came up from Greg Giddens in the question and answer panel earlier is an interesting one. It asks, will we ever shake hands again? And Greg, I am glad we know each other, because I'm going to pick on this a little bit. I think that is interesting because it pushes us into a yes or no space. We might never shake hands again, or we might go back to normal and shake hands as we used to. Or, and this is what I'm hoping this exercise does, we'll learn new ways of greeting each other. This is really off the top of my head, but because this is a global and in certain ways visually global event, perhaps some new form of greeting will become recognizable that is actually a global greeting, as opposed to one that is prevalent in Switzerland with 3 kisses on the cheek, or the United States, or elsewhere. That's a lighthearted space, but there are many opportunities beyond yes, we will, or no, we won't. What else could happen? That's what this kind of exercise is for. The question about climate change and the climate crisis, at its heart, the kind of thinking that you're doing right now, but at a high level and coordinated way, that helps people and institutions prepare for potential crises. This pandemic was not unthought. It simply was unsocialized institutionally, because institutions are not prepared, usually large ones, to think hard the way you just were about what could happen and what risks and opportunities those situations might propose. What are a few other things that you can do with strategic foresight? You can use this. This is an exercise that uses a couple of frameworks. There are others, but you can work with your organization to develop more robust research-based scenarios for planning purposes. It doesn't mean that you do all this desk research and then you get the scenarios. It means you do as much desk research as you can, and then you figure out in a more precise way where it's very worthwhile to be imaginative. Use as much evidence as you can, and then know where you need to use imagination. Use the moment to accelerate any transformation that is sort of understood to be pending anyway, that may be in the realm of something like working virtually and setting up a workplace for telework, which has been emerging anyway. There is building resilience by incorporating foresight activities and monitoring external events in non-crisis moments, and being ready to answer these kinds of questions about where risks and opportunities lie on a regular basis. There is learning the mindset that hopefully we have been modeling through this exercise in your organization by actually teaching people the skills and mindsets of foresight. And I threw this in because it has been on my mind. There's no really post-COVID-19 world. There's just a world that goes on with the ongoing effects of this virus. It doesn't mean that the actual virus has to be a pandemic. What I mean is, we're not going to snap back to the way we were, but nor will everything change. I thought that I would come to you with some scenarios and projections, but frankly, there is so much change unfolding that everyone is thinking about scenarios and trying to understand what is happening. Just make sense of that. And that's probably appropriate. There is no understanding right now about what is going to happen, what next year will look like. But we can say this with confidence. New scenarios that do unfold will neither be the way things were last year or totally different. What happens with respect to COVID-19, those first and second order effects that you began to posit in this activity, those are going to intersect existing trends, and they may accelerate some of them or intensify them, and they may put a stop to others. This is a short list of some of those that seem to be merging as possibly being accelerated or intensified. The use of public surveillance, such as in South Korea, or the use of health security as a national security, that may or may not be good, as I think it was Greg also noted earlier, but in any event, there's a lot of surveillance capability technologically, and a wide open door right now to use it. So I think we'll see a lot around surveillance. Tensions between globalism and nationalism, which we've been aware of anyway in the last 3, 4, 5 years, are likely to intensify. But there will be counter trends as well. Localism, perhaps. Tele-everything, that seems probably not surprising. Versions of scientific collaboration. Some of the additional areas are maybe inequality. There's been a widening wealth gap in the world that seems poised to not get better. new ways of new paradigms of government, industry, and individual interaction as well. Um, Ways in which citizens start doing things almost as institutions, forming health brigades, performing surveillance, doing triage in medical spaces, and the like. And then there are some places where there are question marks. So that is what I had hoped to share today. I'm very hopeful that it has been in some way useful to you. Once again, thank you all very much and take care. We'll be reaching out again to see if we can be useful. Bye-bye.